coming to you live with this special webinar for our monthly Creation Justice webinar that I am proud to co-host with the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who I know is coming to us from DC as he's the Interfaith Power and Light has their big annual conference going on there right now. Michael is the executive director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, and in addition to being a pastor at Rush Memorial United Church of Christ in Atlanta. So delighted to be here with Michael, and delighted to have this webinar opportunity with a fabulous guest that I know many of us are looking forward to hearing from today. When we booked Adrienne, at that time, we did not know you're going to be breaking on to the New York Times bestseller list.
Honey, nobody did.
What's that?
I said, honey, nobody did.
So, but we're delighted to have you on here. And so what we normally do here is Michael will give us some theological framing as we get started. Michael, as I was thinking about today's webinar, while serving my daughter's breakfast this morning, I was thinking, what can I say to this audience to kind of pave the way for you to give us some wisdom? And it occurred to me that what we do with our monthly Creation Justice webinar is we provide some guest presenter who gives spiritual and intellectual nourishment. And I just happened to be serving my daughter a crumpet with peanut butter on it. And I didn't even know what a crumpet was until a couple of years ago. It's kind of like English muffins. And I was thinking, the crumpet with peanut butter is the metaphor for today. We are providing some intellectual, spiritual nourishment for people here and trying to figure out what we can do to bring environmental justice and root ourselves in our faith communities and bring that environmental justice to the world. So, Michael, I'll hand it over to you to give some theological framing before we dive in and get started with our guest for today.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Brooks. I am excited to be here. As Brooks has said, I am coming live from DC at the IPL, or the Interfaith Power and Light Conference. And during that conference, I had an opportunity to present on how we actually are functioning versus how we need to function because society has shifted. I want to frame the theological framing. Let me start off by saying that what I'm getting ready to do may not be directly rooted to theology, but it has roots in theology. The woman who would become known as famed comedian Moms Mabley, who was born Loretta Mary Aiken in Brevard, North Carolina, on March 19th of 1894. And some sources say that she was born in 1897. She was born to a large family, and growing up, she experienced some tragedies. Her father died. He was a firefighter, and he was killed in an explosion when she was 11. And then later on, her mother was hit and killed by a truck on Christmas Day. And even by the time that she became, she started off as a teenager, she was raped twice, and both times she became pregnant. But one of the things that she would say, she took that those tragedies and made those tragedies to become a great career and comedic timing. And she took that, she would say, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you always get. And I believe that that's rooted in theology in itself, that saying. She took what was tragic for her, and out of that emerged this resilience. And she was able to use that resilience, put humor to that resilience, and at the same time give wisdom. And I think that that's what Emergent Strategies does. It's bottom up organizing. Actually embodies the Hermes principles of democratic organizing, which is something that I actually preach and teach because I believe in it wholeheartedly, which is the Hermes principles of democratic organizing say that we ought to be inclusive. It says that our emphasis should be on bottom-up organizing. It says that people should be able to speak for themselves. We ought to work together in solidarity and mutuality, and build just relationships among ourselves. And last and most importantly for me, we've got to commit to a self-transformation. In order for things to change, we have to change. If you do what you've always done, you will get what you always get. I look forward to hearing what Adrienne Maree Brown has to say. I'm excited. I've heard all over the place that she's excellent. So I'm getting ready to turn it back over to you, Brooks, so you can bring her on to do what she's got to do.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And as always, I'm taking notes while you speak so I can preach it this Sunday as my own. But we're delighted. I think probably for a lot of people joining us today, they already know of Adrienne Maree Brown, but if there's somebody who's traveled from outer space to be here today and doesn't already know her, she is the co-editor of Octavia's Brood Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. She is the author of Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. Her latest book, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, raises questions like, how can we make social justice the most pleasurable human experience? In that, at the opening of that book, she describes herself pretty well, I think. I'm a facilitator, emergent strategist, doula, healer, anti-extraordinaire, and pleasure activist. With a description like that, I think everybody wants to hang out with you, probably, Adrienne. So we're delighted to have you here. I know here in the national offices of the United Church of Christ, you've got a fan club that's listening in right now. So we're delighted to have you with, and we'll hand things over to you. So with you, if people have questions, they can hit the Q&A box icon at the bottom of their screen, and we'll hold on to those towards the final part today, and then we can take a stab perhaps at addressing some of those. Sound good?
That sounds great. Well, thank you for having me. It's really beautiful to get to be here with y'all. Thank you for that framing. And particularly, I love just the idea that so much of our wisdom comes from trauma, comes from surviving the hardest things. And that a huge part of what being a human being means is like, we're going to go through hard things, we're going to suffer, but then what do we do when that happens? And I think that determines who we become. So, and I want to save as much time for Q&A as possible. This is one of the things I notice is, for me, it's much more rich to hear like, well, what are y'all wondering about? So I'm going to just read and share a few pieces that are kind of the crucial texts from the book. I have said, and initially I was like, I don't know if my publisher is going to love that I say this all the time, but I always tell people you can get away with just reading pages 15, 41, and 42 of the book, and that has like all the crucial stuff, and the rest is like the accoutrement. But I'm going to just break all those things down for you. But first, I thought I would share something that, as I've been doing more events, there's a lot of people who found this really helpful, which is I wanted to talk a little bit about, what are the things that we have learned that have set us on the path that we're on now. When we talk about, we need to unlearn some things. We need to like start moving in a different direction. First, I want to name some of the things that I see that are like these interconnected ways of thinking, ways of believing that actually put us into crises, multiple crises we're in now, particularly when it comes to relating to the natural world. So the first is we learn to disrespect indigenous and direct ties to land. We learn to be quiet, polite, indirect, and submissive, not to disturb the status quo. We learn facts out of context of application in school. How will this history, science, math actually show up in our lives or in the work of growing community and home? We learn that tests and deadlines are the reasons to take action. This puts those with very good short-term memories and a positive response to pressure in leadership positions. leading us to urgency-based thinking regardless of the circumstance. We learn to compete with each other in a scarcity-based economy that denies and destroys the abundant world we actually live in. We learn to deny our longings and our skills, and to do work that occupies our hours without inspiring our greatness. We learn to manipulate each other and sell things to each other, rather than learning to collaborate and evolve together. We learn that the natural world is something to be manicured, controlled, or pillaged to support our consumers' lives. Even the natural lives of our bodies get medicated, pathologized, shaved, or improved upon with cosmetic adjustments. We learn that factors beyond our control determine the quality of our lives. Something as random as which skin, gender, sexuality, ability, nation, or belief system we're born into sets our path for survival and quality of life. In the United States specifically, though I see this in most places I travel, we learn that we only have value if we can produce. Only then do we earn food, home, healthcare, and education. Similarly, we learn our organizations are only as successful as our fundraising results, whether the community impact is powerful or not. We learn as children to swallow our tears and any other inconvenient emotions. And as adults, that translates into working through red flags, value differences, pain, and exhaustion. We learn to bond through gossip, venting, and destroying, rather than cultivating solutions together. And perhaps the most egregious thing we are taught is that we should just be really good at what's already possible, to leave the impossible alone. So there's some aspects of emergent strategy. It comes from a few places, and I always think that I'm still learning it. So I want to offer it that way, that I'm like, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out, because I was socialized the same as everyone else was. It's like, nature is something over there that you go visit, dally, and then come back to like the real life, the real world, and organizing and changing things. And the first book that I worked on was Octavia's Brood, that I worked on, that I was like, yes, this makes sense to me. And the idea of that is that all organizing is actually science fictional. Once we start to get our hands dirty with the idea that we are part of shaping the future, that is science fictional behavior, right? There's like, oh, I'm writing basically the sci-fi that the next generations of people will live inside of. And then the emergent strategy piece came in of like, how do we get in right relationship with the natural world? The fact that we live on this divine and abundant planet, but we all act like we're not. And now we're moving into these climate crises, climate catastrophes. I just saw that Scotland declared a climate emergency there today. And it's just like, we're living in times where people are already in apocalypse. But it's actually this incredibly abundant planet that we can partner with. And that, environmental justice enters this, to me, when you think about, well, where are the places where people are already being most negatively impacted by the environmental shifts that are happening? And how do we tune into those places, bring our attention, our time, our energy, our resources to those places and to the leadership of how people are surviving in those places? So I want to read you page 15. There's a Black science fiction writer named Octavia Butler, who I really recommend you read all of her texts. It's actually one of the first footnotes I have in the book is, if you haven't read Octavia Butler, just put down my book, go read all of her books, and then come back and read this, because her way of thinking was so thorough. And she really talked about this tension that exists between those of us who are raised, as I was, in a Christian environment, in an environment of faith, and then those who are like, okay, and the world is changing and there's something we need to do about it. Like, even, if you have a standard of like, I believe in heaven, then it's like, okay, but our job is not to make this hell, right? And then if you have other beliefs, it's like, in some ways, this is a heaven. This is a beautiful, abundant Garden of Eden that we live on. Like, how do we land and surrender into the divinity that we've been given? So she addresses some of those tensions in ways that I think are very powerful. But so she wrote all these books, and one of them was called The Parable of the Sower. And in it, she has this whole belief system around getting in right relationship with change. To her, she talks about God as a force of change in the world, which I find to be an idea of God that includes or involves, engages almost every other idea of God I've ever come in contact with. It's like however you orient towards God as an individual, as a spiritual individual, as something larger, it's like that is where change comes from. You pray for those changes to come. You pray for certain changes to stay, right? So it's like, oh, how do I get in right relationship with change? And that's what organizers are doing. We're like, how do we get in right relationship with change? So she wrote this verse in there, and it says, all successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this, use it, shape God. And I love that verse because I feel like it contains, basically the whole book is in there. But what I want to pull out are the elements, like when you're trying to be in right relationship with change, what are the elements that you need to pay attention to? The first is the fractal nature of the world, that the same patterns that we see on the smallest level repeat themselves up and up and up to the largest level. So one small way of seeing this is looking at spirals and waves that move in the ocean, that move in the way wind shapes sand. Even if you look at your fingerprint on your finger, there's this spiral motion, these waves motion, and that's the same shape that our galaxies take in outer space, right? So it's like, oh, there's these beautiful broccoli, ferns, leaves, there's all these shapes that we see the patterns repeat themselves. As an organizer, I think that means we have to pay attention to what we are practicing and what we're doing at a small scale if we want to see it on a large scale. So I will often, when I'm working with groups of organizers, I will often say, how many people here are actually practicing democratic decision-making in their home, right? How many people are actually practicing anything other than a punitive response to harm in their home? And a lot of people are like, you know, kind of maybe sometimes, right? But then I'm like, okay, and what about on your block? What about in your community? And people are like, nope, you know, it falls apart. And so then I'm like, we're in a nation that is struggling to be able to practice democracy with each other. Like we can't make decisions together across difference. And I think that it would be increased if we were all practicing it at a much smaller scale and then growing our capacity up. So Fractal says we need to practice at the small scale those things we want to see come into pass at the large scale. The second piece is being adaptive, right? So a key way of being in right relationship change is adapting with the changes. It's not being reactive, which is one of the ways I see us in this current political moment. It's like the news comes down and then people are like, we got to change our whole plan. It's a total crisis. We got to react. And I'm like, that's not what you see happening in nature when the creatures are surviving. So one of the examples I use of this is if you watch a flock of birds making their way from, say, Canada, geese making their way from Canada down to Mexico. They're like, we are migrating south for the winter. If they get thrown off by a big storm, right, which is sort of like a piece of news from Trump, or whatever you might call it. If they get thrown off by a big storm, they're not just like, all right, we'll just land in New York and we'll just stay here for the winter. They know that they would die if they did that. So instead, they figure out how do we adapt, but with the intention of still making our way to Mexico where we can survive. We as a species also have to figure that out, right? Is how do we adapt to the current changes that are happening with the planet and in relationship with the planet so that we have the longest chance possible to actually be here, that our children can be here and our children's children can be here, that's our intention. The third piece is nonlinear and iterative. And this is kind of like how change actually happens. Many of you may have been a part of this process of developing a strategic plan for your organization or for your institution. And I love doing this because I'm like, how many of y'all, those strategic plans actually worked, right? Almost always I get a 0. Almost always I'm like, where did that plan go? They're like, into a drawer somewhere, maybe. I don't know where it is. We haven't looked at it ever, right? And that's because strategic plans often are set up with this assumption that change can happen in a linear way. And then we get going and, oh, so-and-so's mother died. So-and-so went through a divorce. So-and-so decided that, you know what, this career path wasn't even for her and she left, right? All these things happen, changes happen. And then if we have not created plans that are flexible, that can move, that understand nonlinearity, we're lost. So a lot of it is, oh, how do we create things that understand that change accumulates? Sometimes it bursts through. Black Lives Matter has been a great example of this, where people have been working on Black liberation for such a long time, and even recently for such a long time, and Black people have been getting killed by the police for such a long time. And then all of those factors came together into this wild storm of a moment that suddenly Black Lives Matter was everywhere. And it's not because the creators of Black Lives Matter were the most incredible spreaders of the word, right? Although they are pretty incredible spreaders of the word. But it's also the nonlinearity made all these things line up to be ready. And then iteration is the other part of it. What are you practicing? I often ask people this because a lot of us, we learn to develop an analysis without actually thinking about what we're practicing. And I'm always asking people, like, what are you practicing though? Like, that's what you say you believe, but what do you do? If you say you believe in environmental justice, but you never actually turn to leaders of color, I don't buy it, right? Or if you say that you believe in environmental justice, but there's nothing in your home that aligns you with a better environmental perspective, you know, you still flush the toilet every time, you don't compost, you don't recycle, like all those things. I'm like, okay, like it's not a theoretical thing that others do. Iteration is what we actually practice to put ourselves in right relationship with change. The next one is being resilient. And the way I think humans need to claim that right now is through transformative justice. So transformative justice is at odds with punitive justice. So punitive justice is like, we call the police, we call the state. If something goes wrong, we punish. And we learn punitive justice very early. For many of us, it started in our homes. You did something bad, you're going to get spanked. You're going to go to timeout. You're going away from others. In school, we get put on detention, we get suspension, we get expelled if we're actually so bad. So it's always like, how do we remove these people from society? How do we punish them by taking them away from community and away from belonging? And then we have grown-ups then who are like, I've been punished. They end up in the prison system or end up facing the death penalty. And it's just this punitive nature that, as far as we can tell, doesn't actually work to deter people from harm because it doesn't get to the root of harm. Restorative justice, I think, is a step in the right direction because it tries to restore things to the conditions that they were before. And restoration has been something that the state has picked up. So a lot of prison systems now have restorative justice programs. But the one that I'm really interested in is transformative justice, which says we can't necessarily rely on the state to give us justice. A lot of times they're actually causing harm. But we can, if we deepen into community, get to the roots of the harm and make it so that that harm can no longer happen. That's what I'm interested in when it comes to environmental justice. I'm not interested, like, don't tax people for the carbon they're putting into the air. I want us to go deeper than that and say we can no longer put carbon into the air. Like, we're not going to survive on this planet. And I really do think it's like our species is trying to earn our place on this planet right now. And I'm interested in how do we go deep to transform the wound that has taken place between humans and the planet, right? So if you think about just Black people, you know, I'm just like, what it took, the wound of being displaced from our original indigenous land, the wound of being brought to this place and being put into relationship with land only so that we could work ourselves to death on it. Those are intense wounds to have between yourself and the planet of your home. How do we heal that so that Black people begin to say, I belong here. I can re-indigenize. I can find a root system. I can connect myself to land, right? To me, that's a form of transformative justice. So 2 more. Independence and decentralization goes together. So how do we create systems of leadership, models of leadership that are not about one singular leader at the top, who's very easy to remove? How do we create systems where everybody understands the vision? And the test I often will give to this is if you ask the person at the top, or if you ask the board of an organization, like, what's your vision? And they say something so poetic and meaningful. And if you go out to the community and you ask them, what do they do? That the community would say either something along those lines, right? Not too far off, or at minimum would say, they help us. They serve us, right? We're better because they're here. Too often, there's no decentralization of vision, right? There's just organizations plugging along, trying to get resources, trying to get money, and trying to stay above water, but not necessarily relevant to the community. And interdependence is how we're born. You know, I said this, I gave a speech the other day where I said, we're literally born into another person's hands, right? Like, we come out of the body of our mother into the hands of another. And we cannot survive without many hands holding us until we get old enough to say, I can walk, I can feed myself, I can discern what's poisonous and non-poisonous, I can determine what's safe and unsafe. And to me, it's such a beautiful thing that interdependence is our nature and our birthright, but then we get trained away from it by capitalism, I think. I think that capitalism says, compete, you're all independent. It's about being as independent as you can be, as individualized as you can be. The trick of it is our planet is not built to sustain us as 1 billion individuals or 8 billion individuals. It's designed to sustain us in communities and collectives that are relying on each other and caring for each other and making the most of our resources. It's a brilliant design. We just have to adapt and get ourselves in the right relationship to it. And the last thing is creating more possibilities. How do we create more possibilities for ourselves to be on this planet? One of the things I love that we see in nature is that the most vibrant ecosystems are those that are most biodiverse, right? and where they're not trying to tell each other to do different things. And this is how I always get through difference, right? I'm like, it's good that we have different opinions. In nature, it's great that there's mushrooms and oak trees. It would be really sad if we only have mushrooms. It would be really sad if we only had oak trees. We need both of them. The mushroom has mycelium that helps the oak trees communicate to each other when there's a new toxin in the environment, and it helps to change the tree's composition so that they're safe. That's wildly imaginative to me. And I think we need to learn how to do that in our communities, to say, if you're a frontline organizer and you're doing direct action and you want to go advocate on the Hill, and you're a banker, but you still want to be a radical human being, and you're a radical pastor, that we're all aligning ourselves with being in right relationship with change. And we're not saying you have to change fundamentally everything about who you are to do that. To me, I'm like, you just have to change how you relate to this planet, how we relate to each other. But you get to do your job, and you better do it well, because I'm not going to do it. I say that. I'm like, I can't do all the jobs. So I think that's all the things. Oh, I'll just read you the principles briefly, and then let's jump into some Q&A. So the principles, I thought the elements were like, if you were to think of ingredients that you needed to throw in the pot, those are the elements. And then how you stir it together, what goes where, that kind of thing, that's kind of the principles. If you cook, you'll know what I'm talking about. So here they are. Small is good, small is all, the large is a reflection of the small. Change is constant, so be like water. That's a lesson from Bruce Lee, the amazing karate artist. There's always enough time for the right work. There's a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. Find it. Never a failure, always a lesson. Trust the people. If you trust people, they become trustworthy. Move at the speed of trust. Focus on critical connections rather than critical mass. This one is really important for those of us who are trying to do mass movement building and like mass change. I always tell people, I'm like, 1 billion names on a petition doesn't matter if you can't count on those names to also go into the streets or intervene when they see racism or harm happening, right? What we need is those deeper relationships where people are like, I didn't just sign my name, I got into practice, I got into community. Anyway, so you build the resilience by building the relationships. Less prep, more presence, and then what you pay attention to grows. So, you have questions, thoughts, feelings, responses?
Great, thank you so much. If people are like me, they're probably busy processing and taking all that wonderful wisdom in. Again, people can post questions in the Q&A part. And let's see. As we wait, Michael, do you want to chime in with a question? I know I could give a question, but I just want to give up the opportunity.
Awesome.
Let's see. I see in the chat people are wanting to know the names of some books for Octavia Butler.
Oh, the names. Okay, so Octavia Butler, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents. Sower is S-O-W-E-R. And The Parable of the Talents, that's where I would say to start. She actually has a president in that book. She predicted this. She wrote these in the 80s. She has a president that runs for office on the slogan, Make America Great Again, who's like a radical right fundamentalist president, right? So boom, that's one text. And then the 3 pages is page 15 that has the little piece of Octavia and the elements. And then 41 and 42, that's the principles. And actually the what I just read, the like what we get taught in school kind of thing, that's pages 47 and 48, I think. So those are your pages. Great. What have you experienced working with other faith communities, interfaith or progressive Christians? Are you finding folks are receptive to emergence? I've been blown away. I wasn't sure if anyone outside of like the small enclave of like Black liberation organizers would be open to these ideas. And I really wrote it with them in mind. And I've really been blown away. I've had a few groups of different pastors now come, and we've done like trainings on how to bring emergent strategy in to these spaces. And I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, as I said, I grew up, my grandfather was a Christian evangelical down in the South, and I grew up sort of bouncing myself against him and trying to understand. You know, he was telling me some things that I needed to understand. And one of the things that always interested me was the distinctions between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that we get offered both of these, so that we don't get offered one image of God, but that we even get to see that God changes, right? That God is shaped, that God does things. And then there's a sense of, I don't know if it's regret, but there's a sense of like, I will never do that again, right? I think of that with the flooding all the time, where I'm like, are we about to be in the flooding zone, you know? Because I thought that God said that God was never going to do that again, you know? And we get to see the move from a vengeful God to a God, to Jesus. You know, to me, Jesus is my dude, right? I love Jesus. And I like, Jesus is all about like, the crown's already been paid for. James Baldwin has this quote, that your crown has already been bought and paid for. That your place as a human being that is miraculous has already been attended to. All you have to do is sort of surrender yourself to the idea that you are in this divine relationship. There's nothing you have to do to create that. To me, that is a way of understanding emergence. It's another way of understanding it. That I'm like, we are already on this incredible planet. We don't have to go find one. Like, I love space travel theoretically, but the older I get, the more I'm like, we're on the most incredible, beautiful planet. It has everything we need to survive. And why can't we accept it? The divine gift that we've been given with this place. And then I get very excited when I see people who are accepting it and who are using spaces of faith to be like, this is the gift we were given. How do we protect it? So there's been a lot of opening in those ways. And then I think church is also a place where folks understand, maybe more than any other place, the power of relationship. The power of relationship, right? That, like, you know, I don't know about most of y'all, but for me, I have the places of worship, the places of spirit that I have come to in my life have almost always been through relationship. It's I remember one year, my family grew up in the military and we had just moved to a new location. And the pastor of the local church, I still don't know how he found out we had just moved, but he found out we had just moved in, and he came and knocked on the door, and he sat and talked with us for 3 hours, and we all fell in love with each other. And so we went to that church, and there were people in the church we liked. There's a lot of people we didn't like, but we loved him, and we saw what he was up to. He was like, I'm trying to think differently about how race and culture are held in this space, in this world, in my life. And so we built a relationship with him. I know a lot of people go to church primarily for the relationships, whether they believe what's happening in the pulpit or not. To me, that's also about emergence, that people are building the deep relationships with each other. Pastors might come and go, right? The leaders might come and go. And I always say that for our communities, we want that level of strength, that people are coming in contact with each other. That's what they're longing for and hungry for. And then our job as leaders is to kind of get out of their way, to be like, okay, build with each other, and then support when stuff does emerge. I'm always saying, like, how do I lean back and then make room for emerge from you all? And what emerges when people are given the opportunity, that's where you get these incredible kitchens of soups and meals and all this stuff, these incredible ideas about redistribution of resources, that people are so much more generous when they're left to their own devices and realize it themselves, rather than someone shaming them and being like, you know, and this is why I think is where we've been going wrong with a lot of our environmental work, is trying to shame other humans around their behaviors, instead of being like, of course you're out of alignment with the planet. Like, that's literally what you have been programmed to do by our economic system, is to get out of alignment, come back into alignment, right? Don't be ashamed about it, but let's show you some ways. I'm also always interested in, like, how do we show people what it looks like? And, you know, the church to me is a great place where those practices can be instituted, right? It's like, here's a place that you're going to come every week and you're going to practice composting. You're going to practice recycling. You're going to practice gender neutral bathrooms. You're going to practice getting in alignment with each other, being in right relationship with each other. It's a place to practice values. And I think those spaces are so valuable.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Hey, Adrienne, you've got like 10 questions waiting on you in the queue. So I'm going to try to, that's in the Q&A. Now it's 11, and then you've got them in comments as well. So get ready, because you're gonna be talking a while.
All right, cool.
The first question is, please recommend
the best Octavia. That was the parable of the sower and the talents. And then this one, particular Jesus stories or resources in scripture that you often find. I work with the story of Jonah a lot. That I'm like, we can try to deny what our actual role is in terms of getting in right relationship with the planet. And I think, like Jonah, we'll keep getting called and called and called and put into harder and harder circumstances until we answer the call to actually become leaders in our community and not run away from it. So I use that story a lot. And then what I was just speaking about, to me, the transition of like how justice gets meted out, that when Jesus is being attacked, instead of smiting the entire world, flooding the entire world, destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, doing something else, it's like, I'll sacrifice myself. right? And to me, I think there's an aspect of organizing that's about that. I'm not going to punish others. I'll take some of this on, and then I'll keep growing, right? Celebrating the dents we make, because the victories seem hard to obtain. I'm all about small victories and like getting really loud about small victories. There's one group that I work with that every time we make a decision together, we put on a 90s R&B song and we all sing it together out loud at the top of our lungs and dance, so that we recognize like we just did something. We decided where to order lunch together. We think that we can't do anything together, so that's good. What are other alternatives of decentralization that can counter capitalism? I'm really interested in cooperative economics. I'm really interested in any effort of folks coming together and saying, we're going to share this resource, whether it's a home, whether it's a garden, whether it's a community space, whether it's a store, right? Saying that this is something that's going to actually be in service of community rather than something where we're just competing with each other to make as much as we can and take it out of community. And, you know, socialism, right? People are like, ugh, you can't talk about socialism. But I'm like, a lot of times when I talk to people, I'm like, so you want everyone to have healthcare, everyone to have education, everyone to have access to a home, living wage for all people, you know, free travel, all that stuff. I'm like, that's socialism. So I think it's something really interesting to me for folks to grapple a little bit with, like, why do we feel so resistant? I think a lot of it is how humans have practiced bringing socialism into the public sphere. And I think that can go better, but the ideas are you know, it's like, there's also a really great writer named Gar Alperovitz, who I quote in the book, but he talks about cooperative economics as being an opportunity between capitalism and socialism. So I think there's some interesting stuff there. Let's see, Veterans for Peace question. How do we recognize the value of working together beyond our own special areas of interest? I think that's great. A lot of it, I think, is like bringing our attention to what we really care about, but not having to complain about other people doing something different. Because that's my thing, is I'm just like, if you don't like that strategy, don't do that strategy. It's fine. But I think we spend a lot of time and a lot of space in like comments on the internet going in and being like, this is dumb, or I don't agree with this strategy or whatever. And I think instead of being like, thank you. And, you know, during the civil rights movement, there was like such a tension between like, do we take direct action? Do we do like nonviolent civil disobedience? Or do we go into the halls of Congress and make these demands of government? And one of the things we can see now looking back through history is that the advances that were made in policy would never have been possible if there had not been the pressure of the nonviolent direct actions that were happening, and the way that that narrative shifted. That you were saying Black people and white people can't sit together at a lunch counter. Well, we just saw it. It happened. That was a direct action. And then you have to change your mind, right? So to me, I think we're in a similar place now where people are like, direct action, that's too harsh or something. And it's like, it's so amazing that young people are willing to get in the streets and say, no, protect our planet. We are not going to move forward as if business as usual. That passion is something we want to harness. We want to affirm that those kids care, right? To me, I'm like, that gives me hope. And then our job, and Toshi Reagan is an incredible thinker, writer, artist. One thing she says is our job is actually to protect our young people, to protect the part of them that still feels the hope it takes to walk out in the street and say no, right? We need to protect that energy. And our job is to actually go out and vote and go out and engage policy and actually go out and do that sort of structural work that responds to our demands. So those are some of the things I think there. All right. Okay, people are too busy. Yes, Kelly Ryan, I agree. You know, one of the things I've been noticing now is the way we relate to time when it comes to organizing is often from a place of scarcity. And I find it often happens, the facilitator will do it. We only have 5 seconds and we need to do 3 years of work. So everyone don't talk, you know, basically. And it's just like, okay, that's not gonna work. So a lot of my work as a facilitator is figuring out what is the essential thing that this group needs to deal with in this meeting or in this moment. And how do we not try to do everything, but how do we do that one thing well? Sometimes I call it the domino. That's like, if we hit this domino the right way, it'll knock open a lot of other dominoes, right? It'll like change the landscape. And for me, the first domino is almost always how we communicate and how we make decisions. That if a group can get really good and clear about how it's going to communicate with each other and how decisions happen, then they start to build trust with each other, and then they can speed up what happens in an amount of time. I always say that trust is slow work, and then it creates so much speed, right? Groups that trust each other can move almost as one unit.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, let me take a drink of water. Water is life, right?
While you're doing that, Adrienne, there are some additional questions that are in the chat as well.
Okay. Do you see one that's popping? Do you see one that's exciting?
I did. I am trying to get her name. I'm not sure of her name, but it says, as a white woman who did my best to follow grassroots leaders of color during a very intense and difficult campaign, I was heartbroken to see the emotional and sometimes even physical brutality many of the women in leadership positions faced during the campaign. The trauma seemed to radiate out to the point where I no longer knew how to support them and where things were being asked of me, such as pressuring me to quit my job to join the campaign full time. That I just couldn't give. How can we support leaders whose trauma is speaking so loudly, and how do we support our friends' decisions when we fear that for their safety?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think that speaks to something that I don't know gets named often, which is like the levels of trauma that we're in are different, right? It's actually different to be like, I recognize that this world has gone off the tracks, but it doesn't directly impact me every day, versus folks who are like, I know that it's going off the tracks because I'm being targeted or because things are happening every day. It sounds like that was a really hard situation. And there's a couple of things that I said. One is the act of people of privilege decentering themselves in the work is really crucial. And sometimes the first few rounds of doing that are really uncomfortable and hard, right? Where you're like, I don't really know what to do. And the act of stepping into center or taking leadership when you've been socialized not to are also really hard. So I think there's something around the learning curve of being like, this is going to be difficult. You're carrying trauma, and I'm supposed to take leadership from you. And the more transparent you can be about that, I think the better it goes. I also think debriefing is how you make a failure into a lesson. So when you go through something like that, and it's like, this was really hard, and so hard that it makes me like, I don't know if I would want to do it again. The key in that space is to actually debrief, right? To sit down and, it's like, there's only so much I can tell you because I wasn't there, but I bet those women who were in leadership and facing all that trauma, but they've got a lot of thoughts on how that could have gone differently. And so being able to sit down and say, what can we learn from this? And I often say, sitting down right afterwards is cool, but also waiting 6 months and then coming back together once the smoke is cleared, once things have died down a little bit, coming back and being like, okay, how are these lessons continuing to resonate with you? Are new lessons emerging? Is there something you're longing for? And what a lot of times happens is we get to benefit then from the fact that hindsight is 20/20, right? It's like, oh, in the moment, I couldn't see this because I'd never done it before, or I'd never taken this kind of leadership before. I'd never come in contact, as a white person, I'd never come in direct contact with the trauma that Black people are living with every day. And it overwhelmed me. I didn't know. But now, having been through this experience, here's what I imagine I could do differently. And then I also think there's a real piece of work that a group called the Catalyst Project has been involved in. Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, is also really amazing. But the Catalyst Project has a program called the Ann Braden Program that is specifically designed for white folks who are like, I want to be a part of change, be a part of growth. And instead of you getting thrown into working, taking leadership where you don't have any support, it provides a supported space where you're going into an organization that's led by people of color, but then you come back and you have a cohort, and you have coaching, and you have support. You're like, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm learning. So I really think that I really highly recommend that project, because I do think it's important for white folks to, as much as possible, do that work amongst themselves to show up well, so that Black people, in addition to the trauma, or people of color, immigrants, folks who are like, I'm already under the weight of so much oppression, I don't also have time to do a master's class on race relations right now, right? Some folks, that is the calling, but there's a lot of people who, it's like, that's not what I'm called to do. Yeah, the Catalyst Project, and it's called the Ann Braden Program, ANNBRADEN. And Braden.
Adrienne, here's another great one that I thought, and let me first say, I apologize to everybody that we can't get to each and every question. We just simply don't have the capacity to do that. We've only got so much time, and so we've got to pick and choose, unfortunately. So please don't feel disrespected by us not getting to your question. It's not that it's not important or valid. It's just that we're restricted by time. Kermit Hovey asks, the speed of trust is a new tagline I've heard before your talk. And again, that idea came up from you. Are there other books or articles that you draw from regarding the importance and the work of building trust and developing impact from that?
Yes. So I first heard this term, this phrase from an organizer named Mervyn Marcano, who works at Blackbird and was using it inside the movement for Black Lives work. And then as we kept tracing it back, it was like Stephen Covey had said it, and then I found like 14 other people who had said it. So I was like, okay, this is one of those ideas that seems to have popped off simultaneously in a lot of different places. And so I dedicated a lot of Emergent Strategy to what are the tools by which you actually do trust building, because I think it's one thing to say, like, we all need to build trust with each other. And I think it's a very different thing to actually get involved in the work of building trust. And something that I've noticed is that a lot of people have a really hard time with the vulnerability that it takes to build trust. So I'm really a big fan of the work of Brene Brown, B-R-E-N-E, Brown. And she does a lot of work around vulnerability specifically. And how do you get in touch with kind of your own capacity to be in vulnerability, to hold vulnerability with others, to show others and be vulnerable. And to me, trust, like I'm like at the opposite side. So I'm like, oh, now I default to start with trust, right? Rather than what I was trained to do, which was like, all right, I'm gonna start with skepticism, and I have about 18 hurdles. And if you get through all of those hurdles, you know, then I'll be like, okay, you can come work with me. And I'm like, it's a very like tight, closed way to control things. And it's really hard to keep track of. And the reality is people are not trustworthy yet, right? We're trying to build that with each other. I always tell people, I'm like, we've been taught to lie, you know, like, and not because we're like, I'm a liar, I can't wait to just lie to you today. But it's more like we get taught to lie to protect other people's feelings, to be polite. You know, like when I trace it back, I'm like, oh yeah, like eat that, you know, Brussels sprouts casserole that your grandma made and you put a smile on and you tell her you like it, right? Like it's very early, and a lot of it is harmless training, but then all of a sudden you find yourself as an adult where someone is causing harm in a workplace and you are unable to actually say, what you just did is harmful. And even if someone asks you for direct feedback, you're like, no, I mean, you're doing okay. You know, I mean, maybe you could like, you know, it's just like so contorted. And it's to say like, you did something and I'm going to trust you enough to receive feedback. I'm going to trust myself enough to say that feedback out loud. I'm going to trust other people to see what I can't see, right? As I've become a more prominent leader, it's been very important to me to have relationships with people who are not putting me on a pedestal or just saying yes, yes, yes to everything I do and say. It's very important to me to have people that I can trust to be like, girl, you're out of pocket. You know, like you went too far right there. You need to turn around and give credit to this or that person. And it's like so helpful to me to live in trust. It's actually like it requires less work. Once you start to live in trust, it requires less work because you also learn then to have boundaries with people who are not yet trustworthy, right? And even offering, I'll say this, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people practice, but when you give someone a boundary, like when you're like, I can't trust you and here's a boundary that I need, that also is an act of an invitation to trust, right? It's like, if you can hold this boundary with me, then that'll open up some more possibility for trust down the line. And I find this especially true if you've ever been in a space where you're like trying to work together, but people are also like in love with each other or dating or married, and then the relationship splits and moves into different directions, but you're still in community together. And all of a sudden, you know, a number of things happen there. You find yourself like, which of the partners is more trustworthy? Which of the partners do we keep in community? Are we building a story against the other person? But, you know, if you think about the resource of God or the resource of the divine or the resource of the earth, it's like no one doesn't deserve those things. Like, there's no one who's just like, well, you're not trustworthy, so you don't deserve bread. You know, it's like, no, that's not how blessings come. They come for everyone. It's always for everyone. And so there's a way that we have to learn how to trust that even if we can't see someone's goodness or someone's right to be here or anything like that, that doesn't mean they don't have it. And so a lot of the work I do is like, can you trust that there's something larger in place than just your own perception? When I do mediation with people, I'll say this: I do mediation from a perspective of, can you trust in something larger than yourself? Can you have faith in something larger than yourself that's in motion, and you're not trying to destroy the world, destroy the movement?
This last question from Thomas Martinez.
Okay.
What have you experienced working with other faith communities, interfaith or progressive Christians? Are you finding folks are receptive to emergence?
I'm finding people very receptive. I will say that I've had several churches, several pastors actually do series where they are preaching as almost like a comparative philosophy or comparative text, comparative sacred text. Which was a trip for me because I was like, what? I was like, put some things in there that I would not necessarily put like in a Bible, but it's all good. But yeah, people have been doing work to make comparisons between the two. And I think that there's a lot that is resonating for people, particularly in the realm of creating more possibility, and how the idea that there's not possibility is actually a way that we are losing faith. And so there's a way that, creating more possibility or recognizing that there's still yet another way or many other ways is an act of faith. I've also had like other kinds of space, so I've had rabbis reach out to me who are teaching it. I have had imams reach out to me who are teaching it. It's been wild. Yeah, it's been wild. It's definitely taking off. I think something that people are really appreciating is that it allows for the kind of small radical changes that can happen inside of a church, inside of a community, to be celebrated and uplifted as meaningful. But I think it also calls people away from models that are just about charity or missionary work. It says it's not about going off to some other place that you don't live and that you don't know intimately and saying like, we're here to give you some shirts or give you some water or something. It's more like, how do I deep in and notice the front lines of oppression in the community that I'm in and in my own life? How do I drop in and say, I will no longer participate? Like I always talk about this. I'm like, if there's people hungry half the world away, it's probably because of practices we're engaged in here, like economic practices. That's, to me, the responsibility of being an American who pays taxes here, recognizing the impact, the trickle-down impact of scarcity that we are putting out to the rest of the world. I'm like, there's probably work in your hometown that needs to be done. And I think for a lot of churches, being called home, being called to actually support people in your own local community is crucial. And then there's something in there about everyone not, like the fact that there's no one disposable, that also seems to be really resonating across different faith communities. That there are traumatized people, and there are people who are struggling to want to be here, struggling to want to be kind to each other. And then part of our work as communities that believe in this beautiful world and believe in the blessing of what we've been gifted here, part of our work is to actually attend to that and to say, like, I will catch you. I won't let you fall through the cracks. I won't let you end up in a system that doesn't care for you and love you. We'll be here for you. And if someone is shot in the community, like, we will show up and be on the front lines of those protests. Like, I have been blown away by how many pastors and people of faith have said, we will put on our collars and we will stand between the police and these organizers, because we recognize that the fight for other communities, the fight for us to be safe, and the fight for us to belong to this planet, that's divine work that we're up to. That really moves me.
Beautiful. Brooks?
Terrific. Well, I'm afraid I have to be the bad guy and say that we need to start moving towards the end. Awesome. And your comments make me think I need to start looking to see, can we get you like an honorary clergy ordination or something. So, yes. But we always like to end our webinars with Michael giving us a call to action. So Michael, if we think of this experience as not just being intellectually stimulating and spiritually inspiring, but something an experience that can be a launching pad for us, what can you say to us?
Yeah, my closing call to action would be really to tell you to do the work. Before you can do the external work, you've got to do the internal work, and to really be in harmony with others, you need to be in harmony with yourself as well. Scripture says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's internal. And we've got to do the internal work. Doing the internal work will connect us automatically with ourselves, but it'll give us an appreciation for the other as well, once we do the internal work. And by internal work, I mean, even for those who run organizations, if you're listening and you're on this call and you look around and everybody in your organization looks like you and you're not the only one employed by your organization, you got work to do. If everybody you associate with, everybody that is in your circle of influence looks like you, believes like you, agrees with everything that you do or say, you got work to do, because you've got to do some internal work so you can do the external work. Thank you, Adrienne Marie Brown, for challenging us today on doing that work. Thank you for challenging us to allow things to emerge and to respect one another and respect and be in harmony with nature and be in respect and harmony with our history. All of these things are important for us to do this work. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you again.
Thank you all so much, and blessings on what you're going to do.
Thanks so much. Lots of gratitude. And to everybody else, we hope to see you for our next Creation Justice webinar. We're going to have climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe talk about people of faith, climate messengers. And so I put in a link where people can sign up for that upcoming webinar, which will actually be next Wednesday. So, but finally, let me just get on the gratitude train and say thank you, Adrienne, for joining us. It was terrific to have you with us today. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.